Family Guy did not stumble into controversy by accident. Across its run, it operated on a stated theory of comedy, that an equal opportunity offender who makes the writer's own sympathies clear earns the right to joke about anything. And the show tested that theory harder than almost any program in American television. The catalog of moments where it went too far is really the record of that theory being stress-tested in public, sometimes landing as sharp satire, sometimes collapsing into the exact caricature it claimed to be mocking, until the people making the show concluded on the record that parts of the theory no longer held and began walking them back. The three pillars: the show's self-defined rules of offense and how they were argued, the specific episodes and jokes where the network, the public, or real events forced a reckoning, and the slow, on-record revision from the recasting of its main black character to the announced phasing out of gay jokes that amounts to the show grading its own past. Welcome to Red Umbrella. If you enjoy long, calm breakdowns like this one, the subscribe button helps the channel a lot. The rules of the game: a show canceled twice in its first 4 years, written off by its own network, and then resurrected almost entirely on the strength of DVD sales and late-night cable reruns, does not come back from the dead on shock value alone. Family Guy came back on the strength of a claim about what comedy is allowed to do, and that claim has stayed remarkably consistent from the show's debut on Fox in 1999 through every later firestorm. Understanding that claim first is the only way the rest of this story makes sense, because almost every moment people point to as the show going too far is really a moment when this single underlying rule was being put to the test. Seth MacFarlane built the program around a position that he has restated in one form or another for most of his public life. The position is usually summarized as the equal opportunity offender defense, and the logic runs like this: if a comedy mocks every group, every belief, every public figure, and every sacred cow without exception, then no single target has grounds to feel singled out, because the joke is not really aimed at any of them individually. The cruelty in this reading is distributed so evenly that it cancels itself out. Everyone is a target, so no one is the target. A program that operates this way, the argument goes, has earned a kind of immunity, because its offensiveness is a method rather than a prejudice. That defense has had supporters from inside the operation itself. Kevin Michael Richardson, a black voice actor who worked within MacFarlane's world of shows, once explained his own comfort with the material in plainly conditional terms, telling interviewers that if the humor only ever went after black people, there would be a real problem, but because it goes after everybody, he was able to laugh along with it. Sources record that endorsement, and it matters because it came from exactly the kind of person the show's critics worried about. A performer of color, working on the material, signing off on the philosophy in public, was precisely the credibility the equal opportunity argument needed. There is a complication buried in that defense, though, and it surfaces the moment the show steps outside its own episodes and starts selling itself. In 2010, when the program was campaigning for industry awards, its team circulated promotional material to voters that placed Peter Griffin into a parody of Precious, the acclaimed film built around a heavy-set black actress in a role of enormous dramatic weight. Critics writing about the show's racial politics have pointed to that brochure as a small but revealing crack in the everyone equally framing, because the joke there was not distributed across all of humanity. It landed in one specific place, on one specific kind of body and one specific film about black womanhood, and it was deployed not inside the fiction of Quahog, but as a real piece of corporate self-promotion. The distance between the philosophy and the practice is the gap this entire video is going to keep returning to. Before going further, the mechanism deserves attention, because Family Guy does not deliver its provocations the way a traditional sitcom does. Its signature device is the cutaway gag, the sudden cutaway from the main story to a brief, unrelated scene introduced by a character saying something reminded them of an earlier moment. On the surface, the cutaway is just a joke delivery system, a way to pack more gags into 22 minutes than a linear plot could hold. Looked at more closely, it functions as something closer to an argument made by association. When the show cuts from a line of dialogue to an image, it is asserting that the two things belong together, that this reminds the writers of that, and the comedy depends on the audience accepting the link for the half second it takes to register. The structure lets the show make a claim without ever having to defend it, because by the time the implication lands, the scene is already gone. A great deal of what people later object to in Family Guy lives inside that half second, in connections the show draws and then abandons before anyone can ask why the connection was drawn at all. This is an interpretation of how the device works rather than a stated production rule, and it should be read as analysis, but it is analysis grounded in the most basic fact of how the show is built. MacFarlane has reached for a specific historical comparison whenever the philosophy comes under pressure, and the comparison tells us a lot about how he wants the show understood. Speaking to an interviewer in 2015, in the middle of fallout over an episode involving Quagmire and a transgender character named Ida, he invoked All in the Family and its central figure Archie Bunker. His argument was that Archie said genuinely ugly things on television in the 1970s, and audiences laughed, but they laughed because the show made clear where its own sympathies lay. The writers, MacFarlane suggested, were obviously not on Archie's side, and that shared understanding between creator and viewer was what made the bigotry playable as comedy. He went on to worry aloud that a culture increasingly built around isolated clips and sound bites would strip lines like Archie's out of context, judging the worst sentence a character says without any of the framing that gave it meaning. Whether that worry was prophecy or self-justification is something later sections will test, but the comparison establishes the standard the show wants to be measured against. The defense is not that the jokes are harmless. The defense is that the creator's true position is legible underneath them. Everything rests on that word, legible. The equal opportunity argument and the Archie bunker argument are really the same argument wearing two outfits. Both insist that the audience can tell the difference between a show that endorses an ugly idea and a show that stages an ugly idea in order to mock the people who hold it. Both assume a viewer sophisticated enough to read intent through irony, to hear a slur delivered by a cartoon, and understand that the cartoon, the writer, and the network all consider the slur ridiculous. When that assumption holds, the philosophy works and the show is doing satire. When it breaks, the same scene stops being a critique of a prejudice and starts being a delivery of one, and nobody watching can reliably say which is happening. That ambiguity is not a flaw the show stumbled into. Academic writers who have studied the program describe it as built into the very approach, because hyperbolic absurdity makes it genuinely hard for an audience to know, in any given moment, whether they are laughing at a stereotype or simply laughing along with it. Consider what the show was inheriting when it premiered. The Simpsons had already proven that a primetime animated family could carry sharp social commentary, but its satire was warm at the center, anchored by a family the audience was meant to love. McFarlane's program kept the family structure and stripped out most of the warmth, replacing it with a relentless, reference-packed comic engine that treated nothing as off-limits, including the affection between its own characters. Peter Griffin, voiced by McFarlane himself, was constructed as a man with the impulse control of a toddler and the cultural memory of a person who had watched too much television, and the show used him as a vehicle for material that a more sentimental program would never attempt. The recurring treatment of his daughter Meg as a household punching bag, the running gag of an infant plotting matricide, a neighbor written as a barely concealed sexual predator, all of it signaled from very early that this was a comedy operating under different rules than its primetime peers. Sources describing the show's identity note that this politically incorrect posture was exactly what separated it from rivals and kept it feeling dangerous to a more adult audience. Danger, of course, is a commodity, and it is worth being honest that the philosophy was also a business strategy. A show that gets talked about for going too far gets talked about, and attention is the currency the entire medium runs on. The revival in 2005 happened precisely because the show had become a phenomenon in reruns and on disc, a cult object whose transgressions were a selling point. None of that makes the equal opportunity defense insincere, and there is good reason to believe McFarlane means it, given how consistently he has argued it across decades, and how his own politics, which lean unmistakably progressive, line up with the side the show usually takes. Yet the commercial incentive sat underneath the artistic one the entire time, and any honest account of why the show went where it went has to hold both facts at once. The philosophy gave the writers a principled reason to push, and the marketplace gave them a financial reason, and the two reasons pointed in the same direction for years. The standard this section has laid out is the one the rest of the video will hold every later controversy against. When Fox shelved an episode out of fear it would read as anti-Semitic, the question is whether the show's sympathies were legible enough to survive the network's nerves. When the show built its most prominent black character and academics accused it of reviving caricature traditions older than television itself, the question is whether equal opportunity offense can absorb a portrayal that critics say lands in a very unequal place. When a joke about Down syndrome drew fire from a former governor and a defense from a performer who actually has Down syndrome, the question is whose reading of the show's intent gets to count. Each of those moments is a single data point in a much longer experiment, and the experiment is the one this section has named. Family Guy spent more than 20 years asking whether a comedy can say anything at all as long as its heart is in the right place, and the show kept running the test in public, in front of an audience that did not always agree on what the answer was. What makes the experiment worth examining rather than simply condemning is that the people running it eventually started revising their own conclusions. A program fully convinced of its own innocence does not quietly retire categories of jokes, and it does not recast a leading character on the grounds that the original casting was a mistake. The fact that Family Guy did both, on the record, in its later years, means the equal opportunity philosophy was never as settled inside the writer's room as it sounded in the interviews. Somewhere along the way, the makers of the show began to suspect that some of their targets had not, in fact, been hit equally, and that some of the half-second connections drawn by the cutaways had done damage the philosophy was supposed to prevent. Tracing how that suspicion grew, episode by episode and controversy by controversy, is the work of everything that follows. The rules of the game are now on the table. The remaining sections are about every time the game produced a result nobody involved could fully defend. Beginning with the very first episode the network itself decided was too dangerous to broadcast, an episode that sat on a shelf for years because of one specific fear about one specific group. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. describing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show's whole defense rested on one idea, that its targets were everyone and therefore no one, and that the writers' real sympathies were always visible underneath the cruelty. That promise held only as long as audiences and networks agreed they could read the show's intent. The first real crack came before most viewers ever saw the episode, when Fox looked at a finished script about faith and money and quietly locked it away. Section 2. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. The first time Family Guy went too far, the audience never got a vote. The verdict came from inside the building, from the same network that paid for the episode, and it came before a single household had the chance to be offended. Fox looked at a finished, fully animated episode of its own show, decided it could not be broadcast, and shelved it. That decision is where the philosophy laid out in the previous section meets its first real obstacle, because the equal opportunity defense assumes an audience that will read the show's intent correctly, and here the show never reached the audience at all. The people who pulled the plug were professional readers of intent, and what they read frightened them enough to bury the work for years. The episode is When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, written by Ricky Blitt and directed by Dan Povenmire, and its tangled history is recorded clearly in the available sources. Its production code marks it as a holdover from the second season's production run, meaning it was built to air around the year 2000, early in the show's life, when the program was still fighting to prove it deserved a place on the schedule at all. Fox executives reviewed the completed episode and grew concerned that its content could be taken as anti-Semitic. They declined to air it. The episode then sat unseen for roughly 3 years, surfacing first on a home video release and then on Cartoon Network's late-night Adult Swim block on November 9, 2003, where it finally reached viewers as an animated artifact the broadcast network had refused to show. A censored version eventually aired on Fox itself on December 10, 2004, more than 4 years after the episode was originally meant to run. By the time most of the country saw it on the channel that commissioned it, the show had already been canceled, revived, and turned into a cultural phenomenon, and the episode arrived not as a season 3 finale, but as a piece of recovered history. What actually happens in the episode explains the nervousness. Peter Griffin, broke and desperate after a financial blunder, decides that what his family needs is a Jewish person to manage their money. Having absorbed the old stereotype that Jewish people possess some innate gift for finance, he prays for one to appear. One does, in the form of an accountant named Max Weinstein, voiced by Peter Riegert, who turns out to be decent, competent, and warm, and who helps the Griffins recover their money. Peter, having decided that Max's success flows from his religion, then sets out to convert his own son Chris to Judaism, reasoning that this will make the boy better at math and guarantee his future. Lois spends the episode trying to stop him, insisting that success has nothing to do with which faith a person is born into. A rabbi, voiced by Ben Stein, appears in the religious material the episode builds around Peter's scheme. Read one way, the structure is a textbook example of the defense MacFarlane has always offered. The character holding the prejudice is Peter, and Peter is the show's designated fool, a man whose every conviction the program treats as evidence of his stupidity. The Jewish character is the only competent adult in the room. The stereotype is voiced by an idiot and disproven by the plot, which is precisely the legibility MacFarlane points to when he invokes Archie Bunker. The bigot is the butt of the joke. The show's sympathies sit plainly with the people Peter is reducing to a stereotype, and a careful viewer is meant to laugh at Peter rather than with him. By the standards set in the opening section, this looks like the system working as designed. A second reading is what kept the episode off the air, and it centers on a single musical number. Midway through, Peter performs a song built on the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the wistful ballad from Pinocchio, repurposed into a wish for a Jewish person to rescue him from his money trouble. The melody is one of the most sentimental in the American songbook, an anthem of childlike hope, and bolting a stereotype onto it is the kind of jarring juxtaposition the show specializes in. The version that ran on home video and on cable included a lyric that reached for the oldest and ugliest of anti-Semitic accusations, the centuries-old charge that Jewish people bore responsibility for the death of Christ. When the episode finally aired on broadcast television, that lyric had been altered into a line that expressed doubt about the accusation, rather than repeating it, softening the most incendiary moment into something the network could live with. The difference between the two versions is small in word count and enormous in implication, and the fact that the change was made at all is an admission that somebody decided the original crossed a line that even this show could not stand behind on a Sunday night. That single edited lyric is the whole problem in miniature. The deicide charge is not a stereotype about money or aptitude, the sort of thing the plot can disprove by simply showing a kind and capable accountant. It is a libel that fueled centuries of violence, and invoking it, even in the mouth of a cartoon buffoon, sets off alarms that a joke about being good with numbers never will. The show's defenders would say the line is obviously absurd, sung by an obvious moron, and therefore safe. The network's editors evidently concluded that some accusations carry too much historical weight to be neutralized by a silly melody, that the half-second association does damage regardless of who is singing, and that the cost of getting it wrong on broadcast television was higher than the comedic payoff. Both positions can be stated clearly, and the gap between them is the same gap the first section production identified. The question of whether the staging mocks the prejudice or merely repeats it has no settled answer, and reasonable people inside the same company landed on opposite sides of it. MacFarlane himself seems to have anticipated the danger, which is part of what makes the episode revealing. On the commentary recorded for the home release, he mentions that he showed the script to 2 rabbis before production, an act that only makes sense if the creator already understood the material was flammable. A writer fully confident in the equal opportunity defense does not feel the need for clergy to vet his script. Seeking that blessing was an acknowledgement, before the episode was even finished, that intent alone might not carry the material, that the show was wandering into territory where being on the right side was not going to be self-evident to everyone watching. The defense laid out in the first section assumes legibility comes for free, that a sophisticated audience automatically reads the irony. The decision to consult rabbis suggests the people making the show knew, even then, that legibility was something they might have to earn, and might still fail to secure. The episode also exposes a structural truth about who actually decides when this kind of show goes too far. In theory, the equal opportunity philosophy is adjudicated by the audience, the great mass of viewers who either get the joke or do not. In practice, for a broadcast program, the first and most powerful reader of intent is the network's standards department, a group of professionals whose job is to imagine the worst possible interpretation of every frame and weigh it against the company's exposure. They are paid to be the least charitable audience imaginable, and a show living on the edge of acceptability lives or dies by their readings. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein demonstrates that even at the dawn of the show's run, before it had the cultural capital to push back, that internal audience could simply refuse to let a joke exist. The cutaway philosophy of drawing a connection and moving on before anyone can object only works if there is a broadcast to move on within. Here the connection was drawn, and the network declined to air the move at all. There is a further wrinkle in how the episode eventually reached the public, and it matters for understanding the show's relationship with its own transgressions. The venue that finally aired it was Adult Swim, a block explicitly built for older audiences and looser standards, and the episode's debut there was promoted as the Family Guy episode Fox would not show. The ban itself became the selling point. An episode shelved out of fear of anti-Semitism was marketed, 3 years later, on the strength of having been too hot for network television, which converted a moment of institutional caution into a badge of edgy prestige. That transformation captures something essential about the economics described in the first section. The philosophy of going too far and the business of going too far are difficult to separate, because the very act of being censored becomes promotional material, and a buried episode accrues a mystique that an aired one never could. The thing Fox feared most about the episode turned into the thing that made people most want to see it. Set against the standard established at the start of this story, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein returns a genuinely mixed verdict, and the mixedness is the point. The episode's plot mechanics support the defense, placing the prejudice in the mouth of a fool and the dignity in the Jewish characters. Its most notorious lyric undercuts that defense, reaching for a libel so severe that the show's own network and the show's own later edits backed away from it. The creator's decision to seek rabbinical input before production shows that even the people most committed to the philosophy harbored doubts about whether it would hold in this case, and the eventual marketing of the ban shows how easily a moment of real ethical hesitation gets repackaged as a brand asset. Every one of those threads is documented, and none of them cancels the others out. The episode is the philosophy's first stress test, and the result is a structure that can be defended in good faith and condemned in good faith depending on which frame of it gets isolated, which is exactly the ambiguity the show was built to generate. What this opening controversy could not do was settle the largest question the show would face, because Judaism in the episode is treated as a religion and a culture, something Peter misunderstands and the plot corrects. The deeper and more persistent accusation against Family Guy was never about faith. It was about race, about bodies and voices and the long American tradition of one group performing another for laughs, and that accusation gathered around a single character the show kept at its center for more than 2 decades. He sat at the same bar in nearly every episode, spoke in a voice that was not the voice of the man performing him, and became, depending on who was watching, either proof that the show could write a fully human black character, or proof that it could not. The argument over him is older than television itself, and the show stepped into it the moment it decided what he would sound like. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A finished episode was buried by its own network over a single anti-Semitic libel, then sold years later on the strength of having been banned, leaving the show's "Whose Side Are We On" defense returning a verdict nobody could fully settle. Faith, though, was never the show's hardest problem. The deepest accusation gathered around one character at the bar, and the tradition behind it is older than television. Section 3. The Race Question, Part 1. Cleveland and the Caricature Debate. For more than 20 years, the most prominent black character on Family Guy was performed by a white man, and almost nobody watching at home knew it. Cleveland Brown sat at the same bar in Quahog beside Peter, Joe, and Quagmire across hundreds of episodes, spoke in a soft, slow, instantly recognizable cadence, and registered for most viewers as simply one of the guys. Guys. The voice behind him belonged to Mike Henry, a white writer and performer who co-created the character with Seth MacFarlane and voiced him from the show's earliest days until 2021. That single fact, a white performer supplying the voice of a black man for 2 decades on one of the most watched comedies in the country, is the doorway into the show's longest-running and least resolvable controversy, because it forces the question the equal opportunity defense was built to dodge. A philosophy that claims to mock everyone equally has to account for what happens when one of its targets is an entire race, performed by someone outside that race, for an audience that is overwhelmingly outside it too. Cleveland's history on the show is worth getting precise, because the character's prominence shifted over time. He appears as far back as the pilot, listed among the residents of Quahog, and grew from a background fixture into a fully established member of Peter's inner circle. By the time the show was a hit, he was a load-bearing part of its world, mild-mannered where Peter was loud, gentle where Quagmire was lecherous, the calm one at the table. In 2009, the character was spun off into his own series, set in a fictional Virginia town, which relocated him into a predominantly black cast and ran for several seasons before he returned to Quahog. Throughout all of it, until the very end of that run, the voice was Henry's, and the writing came from a room that was, like most American television writers' rooms of the era, largely white. Critics who study the show's racial politics have made a specific and serious charge about what that arrangement produced. Their argument is that the Brown family, as written and performed, slides repeatedly into a tradition older than television itself, a performance style in which white entertainers caricatured black people for the amusement of white audiences, exaggerating speech and manner into something between a type and a joke. Cleveland's slow sing-song delivery, his exaggerated mildness, his function as the lone black presence in a white friend group whose gentle absorption of insults becomes part of the comedy, all of it reads, to these critics, as a modern version of that older caricature dressed in animation. The charge is not that the show is casually careless, it is that the show participates, knowingly or not, in a long and harmful entertainment tradition, and that wrapping the caricature in the show's general air of irreverence does not exempt it. By presenting the portrayal as just one more target in a comedy that mocks everybody, the argument goes, the show avoids having to answer for the specific harm of reviving a racial type that already did damage for a century. There is a particular scene critics return to that crystallizes the worry, and it does not even single Cleveland out by race directly. In one episode, the 4 friends are insulted in quick succession by a stranger who dismisses Peter as a fat man, Joe as disabled, Quagmire as a pervert, and Cleveland with a curt reference to his being an old black man, after which Cleveland responds with mild, wounded resignation rather than anger. On the surface, the moment treats all 4 equally, which is precisely the equal opportunity logic in action. Looked at more closely, the equality is exactly what the critics distrust, because flattening race into the same comic register as a man's weight or a man's job treats a category with a violent history as just another personal quirk to be ribbed, and Cleveland's habit of absorbing the insult without protest gets read as the show quietly teaching that a black man's role is to take it and stay pleasant. Commentary on the character has used the word diffidence to describe this pattern, the sense that Cleveland is written to never stand up for himself, to endure harassment with a smile, and that across enough repetitions this stops being a trait of one character and starts being a statement about a group. The show and its makers have a real answer to this, and a fair account has to give it room. MacFarlane has long described the program as an equal opportunity offender, insisting that the very breadth of its targets is what redeems any single joke, and that has been echoed from inside the operation by people the critique would seem to implicate. Kevin Michael Richardson, a black voice actor who worked within MacFarlane's shows, has said plainly that if the humor went after black people alone, there would be a genuine problem, but because it goes after everyone, he is able to laugh along with it. That endorsement matters precisely because it comes from a black performer with first-hand knowledge of the writing, and it cannot simply be waved away as cover. There are also episodes where Cleveland is used as the voice of reason against Peter's ignorance, where the joke is built on Peter's stupidity about race rather than on Cleveland himself, and where the character's dignity is the fixed point the comedy bounces off. Critics who have examined the show closely acknowledge this too, noting moments where the writing routes around the easy racist option, constructing elaborate setups specifically to avoid putting ugly ideas in Cleveland's mouth or making him the embodiment of a slur. In those moments, the show is doing the careful thing, using its black character as the conscience of a scene rather than its punchline. That mixed record is the entire difficulty, and it is the same difficulty the first section named, now raised to its highest stakes. With Faith, in the Weinstein episode, the show could disprove a stereotype within the plot by simply showing a kind and competent Jewish accountant. Race does not resolve that cleanly because the medium itself is part of the message. A white writer voicing a black character is making a choice about who gets to perform blackness for a national audience, and no plot twist inside an episode can neutralize the fact of who is holding the microphone. The equal opportunity defense answers the question of whether a joke endorses a prejudice. It does not answer the question of whether a white-run show should be building its black characters out of exaggerated voices and types at all, which is a question about authorship rather than intent. Those who study the show's racial humor humor make exactly this point, observing that hyperbolic absurdity makes it genuinely hard for any audience to tell whether a given moment is laughing at a stereotype or simply enjoying it, and that this ambiguity is woven so deeply into the show's method that the confusion is not a side effect of the comedy, but a structural feature of it. The promotional history reinforces how slippery the ground is. When the show campaigned for industry recognition around 2010, its own marketing placed Peter Griffin into a parody of a celebrated film built around a heavy-set black actress, a piece of self-promotion that, as critics noted, landed in one very specific cultural place, rather than spreading its mockery across all of humanity the way the philosophy promised. The show's defense lives in the idea of distribution, the claim that no target is singled out. Its publicity, in that instance, singled out a particular kind of black body and a particular film about black womanhood, outside the fiction entirely, as a corporate joke. Holding the philosophy beside the practice produces friction, and the friction is the whole subject of this video. A useful way to hold the debate without collapsing it is to separate two charges that often get blurred together. The first charge is that individual jokes about Cleveland are racist in content, that they deliver demeaning ideas about black people. On that charge, the show has a defensible record in many episodes and an indefensible one in others, and honest viewers disagree about which episodes fall where because the irony really is hard to read. The second charge is structural and harder to escape, and it concerns the basic setup rather than any single gag. A black character built by white creators, voiced by a white actor, written by a largely white room, and used as the neighborhood's lone black presence, is participating in an old arrangement of power regardless of how carefully any given line is written. That second charge does not depend on finding a smoking gun joke, which is why it proved so durable, and why the show eventually responded to it in a way it never responded to its critics on faith or sexuality. The response, when it finally came, was not a better written episode or a sharper defense. It was a change to the fundamental fact the structural critique had targeted from the beginning, the fact of who was allowed to be the voice. That distinction also explains why the equal opportunity defense, so central to the show's self-image, runs out of road here in a way it does not elsewhere. The defense is about content, about the even-handed distribution of mockery, and the legibility of the writer's sympathy. It has nothing to say about authorship, about whose hand draws the caricature and whose voice animates it. For most of the show's targets, content is the whole question, and the defense can at least be argued. For race, content is only half the question, and the half the defense ignores turned out to be the half that mattered most to the people raising the alarm. A comedy can prove, joke by joke, that it does not hate black people, and still be told, accurately, that a white room performing blackness for a white audience is doing something the joke-by-joke defense was never designed to address. None of this delivers a tidy ruling, and pretending otherwise would betray the actual record. Cleveland Brown is, by turns, a warmly written friend, a vehicle for genuine commentary on Peter's ignorance, the gentle heart of a crude show, and, in other moments, a slow-voiced type whose mildness reads to many as a caricature with a long and ugly lineage. All of those Clevelands exist in the same character, performed for over 2 decades by the same white actor, and the show contains the evidence for every competing claim made about him. The argument over whether the portrayal was satire or minstrelsy is older than the show, older than television, and Family Guy did not resolve it so much as supply 20 years of fresh material to both sides. What the show eventually did do was concede, in the most concrete way available, that one part of the criticism had landed. The voice that had defined the character since the beginning was given up by the man who created it, handed deliberately to a black performer, in a public act framed as a correction rather than a casting note. That decision arrived in 2020, at a specific cultural moment, and it raised a fresh question that the recasting itself could not fully answer. Changing who speaks the lines is one thing, changing what the lines say, and the room that writes them, is another, and the gap between those two changes is where the next part of this story lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A black character built and voiced by white creators for 2 decades sat at the center of the show's hardest case, where the equal opportunity defense answered questions about content and went silent on questions about authorship. The criticism that proved most durable was never about a single joke. It was about whose voice was allowed to perform the part, and in 2020 the show finally changed exactly that. Section 4. The Race Question, Part 2. The 2020 Recasting. On June 26, 2020, the man who had voiced Cleveland Brown for more than 20 years announced that he was giving the part away on principle. Mike Henry, who is white, said it had been an honor to play Cleveland across 2 decades, that he loved the character deeply, and that people of color should play characters of color, and for that reason he would step down. The statement was brief, public, and unambiguous, and it conceded in a sentence what critics of the show's racial humor had been arguing for years, that a white performer building a black man's voice for a national audience was a problem no amount of careful writing could fully solve. The structural critique laid out in the previous section, the charge that authorship itself was the issue rather than any single joke, had finally landed somewhere it could not be deflected, because this time the person agreeing with it was the show itself. Timing is the first thing to understand about why the concession came when it came. Henry's announcement arrived in the early summer of 2020, during during the nationwide protests for racial justice that followed the killing of George Floyd, a period when American institutions of every kind were being pressed to examine their own conduct on race. Animation was no exception, and the scrutiny fell with particular force on a long-standing practice the industry had largely ignored: the casting of white actors as characters of color. Henry's exit did not happen in isolation. One day before he spoke, the producers of The Simpsons announced that a black actor, Alex Desire, would take over the role of Carl from Hank Azaria, and that show committed around the same time to having its black characters voiced by black performers going forward. Reporting at the time grouped these moves together as parts of a single reckoning, a coordinated retreat from what was being called voiceover whitewashing across television animation. Other shows made comparable changes within the same window. What had been an unremarkable industry habit for decades became, almost overnight, a thing that needed correcting, and Family Guy moved with the tide rather than against it. 3 months later, on September 25, 2020, the show named Cleveland's new voice. Arif Zahir, a YouTube performer of African-American and Cape Verdean descent who had built a following doing impressions of the character, was chosen to take over, marking the first time a black actor would voice the role in the series. Zahir had put himself forward within hours of Henry's announcement, posting a video in Cleveland's voice volunteering for the job, and the path from fan impressionist to official cast member became part of the story's appeal. In his statement on the casting, Zahir expressed gratitude that bordered on disbelief, calling it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and promising to honor what Henry had built. Henry, for his part, welcomed the newcomer warmly and said Zahir's understanding of and respect for the character gave him confidence the part was in good hands. Henry also remained with the show, continuing to voice other characters and to write and produce, which meant the handover removed him from one role without removing him from the program he had helped shape from the beginning. There is a small, easily overlooked wrinkle in the character's history that complicates the clean arc of a white actor finally yielding to a black one, and the available sources record it. In the show's original pilot, produced before the series proper, Cleveland was voiced by a black performer, Phil Lamar, before Henry assumed the role for the broadcast run. The detail is minor and the pilot version barely circulated, so it changes little about the 20-year reality. It does, though, puncture any tidy story in which the part was simply conceived for a white voice from the very first instant, and it is the kind of fact worth keeping in view precisely because it resists the neat version of events. The character passed through a black actor at the absolute start, spent more than 2 decades performed by a white one, and then returned to a black actor in 2020, and the long middle stretch is the part the recasting was meant to address. What the recasting actually changed is the central question of this section, and the honest answer is that it changed one thing cleanly and left another almost entirely untouched. The thing it changed was authorship of the voice, the specific point the structural critique had targeted. After 2020, the man speaking Cleveland's lines was a black man, which removed the precise arrangement critics had called a modern form of racial performance, a white entertainer animating blackness for largely white viewers. On that narrow and real measure, the show did the thing its critics asked, and did it deliberately, framing the move as a correction rather than a routine casting note. The thing it did not change was the writing. Critics who examined the show after the handover pointed out that Cleveland's characterization, his dialogue, his function within the group, and the comic role he played remained substantially what they had always been. The room writing him was still largely the same room, working in the same register, and the lines Zahir delivered were not meaningfully different from the lines Henry would have delivered. Those who study the show's racial politics drew the obvious conclusion that a change in who performs a character is a surface gesture toward representation that does not, by itself, alter the underlying approach to racial humor. That gap between voice and writing is where the recasting becomes genuinely revealing rather than simply commendable, because it exposes how the show understood the criticism in the first place. The structural critique from the previous section had 2 layers. One layer was about who performs blackness, the question of the microphone. The other layer was about how blackness is written, the question of the type, the cadence, the function as the lone black presence absorbing the neighborhood's slights with a smile. The recasting answered the first layer and left the second standing. A black actor now performs the soft, slow-voiced character, whose writing critics had described as a caricature with a long lineage, which means the most penetrating version of the complaint, the one about the type itself, survived the very change that was supposed to resolve it. If the worry was that Cleveland was written as a diminished figure who never stood up for himself, hiring a black man to voice that figure does not address the worry. It arguably complicates it by placing a black performer inside a portrayal that the criticism had identified as the problem. A fair account has to hold the other side of this too, because there are real defenses of the limited change. One defense is continuity, the simple fact that a beloved character cannot be rewritten overnight without alienating the audience that loved him, and that changing the voice while preserving the personality kept faith with viewers who had spent 20 years with Cleveland as he was. Henry himself framed the handover around keeping Cleveland every bit as awesome as he had always been, which is a promise of continuity rather than reinvention. A second defense is that representation in casting carries its own weight independent of writing, that having a black actor voice a major black character on a top-rated show is a meaningful change in who gets the work and the visibility, regardless of what the scripts say. A third defense, harder to assess, is that the writing of Cleveland may have been less of a caricature than critics claimed, in which case there was less to fix. And the recasting addressed the only legitimate complaint, the one about the voice. Each of these can be argued in good faith, and the strongest critical position does not dismiss them so much as note that they all leave the deepest layer of the original critique unanswered. Set against the philosophy traced through the earlier sections, the recasting marks a genuine turning point, because it is the first moment in this story where the show stops defending itself and starts revising itself. Through the Weinstein episode and the long Cleveland debate, the show's posture was the equal opportunity defense, the insistence that breadth of mockery and legibility of intent excused any individual provocation. That posture is fundamentally a refusal to concede, a way of explaining why the criticism is mistaken. The 2020 recasting is the opposite posture. It is the show agreeing that a criticism was correct and acting on it, abandoning a defense it had maintained for 2 decades. The significance is not that the change was complete, because it was not. The significance is that the change happened at all, that a program whose entire identity rested on never apologizing for a joke quietly accepted that one of its foundational arrangements had been wrong from the start. That shift from defense to revision is the thread the final sections of this video will follow to its conclusion, because once a show admits it got one thing wrong, the question of what else it might revise is permanently on the table. The incompleteness of the change is itself a kind of statement about the limits of what the show was willing to examine. Replacing a voice is a discrete, visible, finishable act that can be announced in a press release and completed in a season. Rewriting a character's entire function, interrogating the comic role of the lone black man in a white friend group, retooling the instincts of a long-established writer's room, none of that is discrete or visible or easily announced, and the show did not attempt it. The path of least resistance ran straight through the voice and stopped there, which suggests the recasting was as much about being seen to respond as about responding fully. That reading is not cynical so much as structural. Television responds to pressure in the units it can manage, and a voice is a manageable unit in a way that a comic worldview is not. The show changed what it could change cleanly, and left the harder thing alone, and the result is a Cleveland who sounds like a different decision and reads like the same one. None of this diminishes Zahir's position, or the reality of what the casting meant for him, and for the question of who gets these roles. A talented performer who had honored the character as a fan was given a career-defining part, and a major black character on a flagship comedy was, for the first time, voiced by a black man. Those facts are real, and they sit alongside the critical point rather than canceling it. The recasting can be simultaneously a meaningful correction and an incomplete one, a genuine concession on authorship and a sidestep on substance, and insisting on only one of those readings would falsify a situation that genuinely contains both. The show did something it had never done before, admitted error and acted, and it did that thing in the narrowest form available, leaving the deeper criticism alive. Holding both halves is the only honest way to describe what happened in 2020. What the recasting could not do was reach back and resolve the moments where the show's provocations had collided with real people who had real stakes in the joke, and the most charged of those collisions did not involve race at all. It involved a single line about a child with a disability, delivered in a Valentine's Day episode, that drew a furious response from one of the most famous political figures in the country. The strangest part of that fight was who rose to defend the show. The most effective rebuttal to the show's most powerful critic came not from a writer or a producer, but from the performer at the center of the joke, a woman who lived with the very condition the episode was accused of mocking. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The recasting was the first time the show stopped defending itself and started revising itself, changing who voiced its black character while leaving the writing that critics questioned almost entirely intact. That move answered the question of the microphone and went quiet on the question of the type. The next collision had nothing to do with race, and its most powerful defender turned out to be the person the joke was supposedly aimed at. Section 5. Extra large medium and the Palin fight. A single line of dialogue in a Valentine's Day episode produced the strangest fight in the show's history. Strange because the most effective defense of the joke came from the person it appeared to be aimed at. Extra large medium aired on February 14, 2010, the 12th episode of the 8th season. Written by Steve Callahan and directed by John Holmquist. Its main story follows Peter after he becomes convinced he can speak to the dead, but the controversy lived entirely in a subplot, in which Chris goes on a date with a classmate named Ellen, a young woman with Down syndrome. When Chris asks about her family, Ellen explains that her father is an accountant and her mother is the former governor of Alaska. That second detail was the whole point, because the former governor of Alaska in early 2010 was Sarah Palin, the 2008 Republican vice presidential nominee, and Palin has a son, Trig, who has Down syndrome. The line connected the character to Palin in a single stroke, and the connection set off a public argument about disability, comedy, and who has the standing to say a joke went too far. Palin responded quickly and personally. Writing on Facebook, she described the episode as a kick in the gut, framing it as another instance of a callous culture mocking children like her son. Her daughter Bristol added her own condemnation, calling the show's writers heartless jerks for building a laugh around a vulnerable group. The reaction fit a pattern Palin had established as a public advocate for special needs families, and it carried real weight because here was a prominent parent of a child with Down syndrome saying plainly that the show had wounded people like her family. By the logic the show had always used to defend itself, this was the nightmare scenario. The equal opportunity defense rests on the claim that the audience reads the show's intent correctly and understands that no group is truly being targeted. Palin read the intent and concluded the opposite, that a child's disability had been turned into a punchline, and she had as much moral authority to make that reading as anyone alive. What complicated the fight, beyond anything the show could have engineered, was the response of Andrea Faye Friedman, the actress who voiced Ellen. Friedman has Down syndrome herself, and she was an experienced performer with years of television and film work behind her, though this was her first role as a voice actress. After Palin's condemnation, Friedman sent a message to a major newspaper that turned the entire controversy on its head. She suggested that Palin lacked a sense of humor, said she personally found the line funny, and pointed out that she understood the concept of sarcasm perfectly well. She described a family that valued laughter and had raised her to live a normal life rather than a sheltered one. Then, she delivered the line that defined the episode's afterlife, a pointed contrast between how she was raised and how she saw Palin treating Trigg, saying her own mother had never carried her around like a loaf of bread, the way Palin, in Friedman's view, carried her son around in search of sympathy and votes. That response reframed the dispute completely, because it relocated the joke's target. Palin had read the bit as mockery of people with Down syndrome, a laugh at the expense of the disabled. Friedman read it as something almost opposite, a jab at Palin specifically, at a politician she believed used her child as a prop for public sympathy. Under Friedman's reading, the character of Ellen was not the butt of the joke at all. Ellen was a fairly ordinary teenager going on a date, written and performed with enough normalcy that her disability was incidental to the scene, and the only person being mocked was the famous mother invoked by a single line. The person with the lived experience of Down syndrome looked at the same scene Palin looked at and saw a defense of dignity rather than an assault on it, and she said so in public, on the record, in terms more cutting than anything the show's writers would have dared. The casting itself reinforces Friedman's reading in a way that connects directly to the earlier parts of this story. 2 sections ago, the show stood accused of building a black character through a white performer, of having someone outside the experience perform it from the outside. With Ellen, the show did the opposite. It hired a woman who actually has Down syndrome to voice a character with Down syndrome, casting from lived experience rather than imitation. The same program that would not, for 2 decades, let a black actor voice its black character reached, in 2010, for an actress with the exact condition the episode was accused of mocking, and that actress became the show's fiercest defender. The contrast is worth holding still for a moment, because it cuts against any simple verdict about the show's instincts on representation. The show was capable of the careless choice and the careful one, sometimes within the same era, and extra-large medium is the careful one being attacked as if it were the careless one. McFarlane defended the episode, and the defense drew support from beyond his own writer's room. He has long argued a version of the idea that most people are capable of telling the difference between a comedic situation and an actual offense, and that the perception of widespread outrage is often exaggerated by the way media amplifies a handful of complaints. He discussed the controversy publicly, including with Bill Maher, whose program he appeared on, and Maher backed him, treating Palin's reaction as an overreach. The defense rested on the same legibility argument that runs through this entire story, the claim that the show's sympathies are readable, and that a fair viewer understands the joke is aimed at a politician's behavior rather than at disabled people. With Friedman in the show's corner, the argument had something it almost never had in these fights, a defender whose authority on the subject exceeded that of the critic. Palin spoke as the parent of a child with Down syndrome. Friedman spoke as a person with Down syndrome, and on the narrow question of whether the joke demeaned her, her testimony was difficult to outrank. The fight does not resolve cleanly though, and pretending Friedman's response ended the matter would flatten something genuinely complicated. There is a real point on Palin's side that survives Friedman's rebuttal, and it concerns the difference between one performer's experience and the broader effect of the joke. Friedman could speak only for herself, for how the line landed on a confident, accomplished woman with a supportive family and a thick skin. She could not speak for every family with a child who has Down syndrome, some of whom may have heard the same line as a signal that their children were fair game for network comedy. A joke can be empowering to the person performing it and still wounding to people watching from a more vulnerable position, and the existence of one proud defender does not erase the discomfort of those who experienced it as cruelty. The disagreement between Palin and Friedman is not a case of one woman being right and the other being foolish. It is a case of 2 people with genuine standing reaching opposite conclusions, which is precisely the situation the show's defense was never designed to handle, because that defense assumes a single correct reading exists and can be recovered by any thoughtful viewer. There is also a structural critique of the joke that neither woman fully voiced, and it concerns the mechanics of how the bit works. The line gets its laugh by attaching Palin to a character with Down syndrome, which means the comedy depends at some level on Down syndrome being the connective tissue of the joke. Even if the target is Palin's political conduct rather than disabled people as a class, the punchline still routes through a disability to reach the politician, using the condition as the vehicle that carries the insult to its destination. A defender would say the routing is incidental, that the disability is simply the factual link between Ellen and Palin, and the satire lands on Palin alone. A critic would say the routing is the problem, that you cannot use a disability as the delivery mechanism for an attack and then claim the disability was never involved. Both descriptions are accurate accounts of how the joke is built, and the disagreement between them is, once again, a disagreement about whether intent and target are enough to redeem a mechanism, which is the question this entire video keeps circling. Set against the philosophy traced through the earlier sections, extra-large medium is the clearest case yet of the legibility defense both working and failing at the same time, depending on the viewer. It worked for Friedman, who read the intent exactly as the show intended and found the result not just acceptable but admirable. It failed for Palin, who read the intent as hostile and found the result painful. The show did everything its own philosophy recommended. It aimed the satire at a powerful public figure rather than a vulnerable group. It cast the role from lived experience, and it built the scene so that the character with the disability was treated as a person rather than a punchline. Having done all of that, it still produced a fight that split the very community it might have claimed to be defending, which suggests that the legibility defense has a ceiling. Some subjects carry so much pain for so many different people that no amount of careful construction guarantees a shared reading, and disability in children is plainly one of them. The show could control its intent. It could not control the wound, because the wound lived in the audience rather than in the script. The Palin fight also marks a subtle shift in the kind of trouble the show was getting into. The Weinstein episode was stopped by a network worried about a libel. The Cleveland debate was a slow argument among critics about authorship and type. Extra-large medium was something newer, a real-time collision with a named, powerful public figure who fought back through the press, turning a single line into a national argument that pulled in politicians, performers, and talk show hosts. The show had become large enough and provocative enough that its jokes could start fights with the actual people they referenced, and those fights played out in public, with the show's writers on one side and a former vice presidential nominee on the other. That escalation in stakes, from network nerves to cultural firestorm, was about to reach its limit, because the next controversy would not be decided by a critic, a politician, or even the show itself. It would be decided by reality, by a real and terrible event that turned a months-old cutaway gag into something the show could not defend, and chose, eventually, to bury. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single line split the people best placed to judge it, with a famous parent calling it cruelty, and the performer who has Down syndrome calling it sarcasm, aimed at that same parent, proving the show could control its intent and never the wound. Until now, every verdict came from a network, a critic, or a public figure. The next one came from reality itself, when a finished joke collided with a tragedy nobody saw coming. Section 6. Turban Cowboy and the day reality caught up. A joke can sit on the air for a month without incident, and then become unspeakable overnight, without a single frame of it changing. That is what happened to Turban Cowboy, the 15th episode of the 11th season and the 203rd episode overall, which first aired on March 17, 2013. When it premiered, it was, by the show's standards, an ordinary entry, dark and tasteless in the usual way, the sort of episode that drew complaints from the usual organizations, and then receded into the catalog. Less than a month later, it became the most quietly buried episode the show had produced in years, removed from the network's own platforms, with no plans to air it again, and it stayed effectively hidden for nearly a decade. The thing that changed was not the episode. It was the world the episode was being watched in. The plot is worth laying out, because it carried two separate problems, and only one of them is the reason most people remember the episode. After a skydiving accident lands Peter in the hospital, he befriends a Muslim man named Mahmoud, and as the friendship deepens, Peter converts to Islam. Quagmire and Joe grow suspicious of Mahmoud, voicing the reflexive assumption that a Muslim newcomer must be dangerous. Brian, the show's frequent voice of liberal conscience, calls them out for that prejudice, which sets the episode up to deliver an anti-bigotry message. Then the twist arrives and pulls the message apart, because Mahmoud turns out to be exactly what Joe and Quagmire feared, a terrorist, and the episode climaxes with Peter accidentally detonating a bomb and destroying a bridge by dialing a phone connected to the plot. The structure raises a critique of Islamophobia, and then resolves it by confirming the Islamophobes were right all along, which is the deeper and more durable problem with the episode. Contemporary reviews said as much, with one critic grading it near the bottom of the scale and describing it as feeling like an episode written a decade earlier, oblivious to how uniformly Middle Eastern characters were being cast as terrorists across the culture. That criticism existed before any tragedy, and it would have been the episode's legacy in a different timeline. What actually defined the episode was a cutaway gag that had nothing to do with the main plot. At one point, Bob Costas, voicing himself, asks Peter how he managed to win the Boston Marathon, and the show cuts to a flashback of Peter driving his car straight through the field of runners, mowing them down to clear his path to the finish line. The gag is built on pure shock, the casual depiction of mass death played as a throwaway laugh, and even in its original context, before anything happened, its sat at the far edge of the show's tolerance for cruelty. Reporting at the time was careful to note that the cutaway was offensive and inappropriate in its unedited form, that no later event was required to make it ugly. The show had simply decided that running over a crowd of marathon runners was a viable joke, the kind of provocation the equal opportunity philosophy was supposed to license, and it put the joke on the air. On April 15, 2013, two terrorists placed homemade pressure cooker bombs near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon. The explosions killed 3 people and wounded hundreds, many of them grievously. The attack was a real crime against real people, and it instantly transformed how the month-old cutaway read. A gag about killing marathon runners, harmless to the show's defenders as long as it stayed safely fictional, now pointed directly at a fresh atrocity. Within a day, the network removed the episode from its website and from its streaming partner, confirming there were no immediate plans to air it again. No edit was made to the episode to justify the removal. The episode was the same as it had been in March. The context had become unbearable, and the show that prided itself on never flinching, flinched, pulling the work rather than standing behind it. A second layer of the controversy was not the show's doing at all, and separating it from the first layer matters for understanding what happened. In the days after the bombing, a deceptively edited clip began circulating online. Someone had spliced together 2 unrelated scenes from Turban Cowboy, the marathon cutaway and the later moment where Peter detonates a bomb by phone, and stitched them into a sequence designed to make it look as though the episode had depicted, predicted, or even inspired the actual attack. The fabricated clip was promoted by the conspiracy theorist and radio host Alex Jones through his outlet, fitting a familiar pattern in which a tragedy is immediately repackaged as evidence of a hidden plot. The clip spread quickly among people who did not realize it was a hoax, and it created the false impression that the show had somehow scripted the bombing in advance. McFarlane responded to that fabrication directly and forcefully, which is one of the more revealing moments in this entire story. He denounced the edited clip publicly as abhorrent, stated plainly that the bombing was a crime and a tragedy, and offered his thoughts to the victims. Members of the show's team, including Seth Green, amplified the statement. The platform hosting the hoax moved to remove uploads of the doctored clip. The striking thing about the response is what it targeted. McFarlane came out swinging against the misinformation, against the lie that the show had predicted the attack, and he was entirely right to do so, because the hoax was a genuine falsehood that defamed the show and exploited a tragedy. Yet the original cutaway, the real content the show had actually made and aired, received no comparable public defense. That was handled differently, by quietly removing the episode and letting it disappear. The show fought loudly to correct the lie about what it had done, and silently retreated from the truth of what it had done. That split response is the heart of what makes Turban Cowboy distinct from everything covered so far. In the Weinstein episode, a network made the call before broadcast. In the Cleveland debate, critics argued for years. With extra-large medium, a public figure fought the show through the press. Here, for the first time, the verdict was delivered by reality itself, by an event the show had no hand in and could not have foreseen, which retroactively rendered a joke indefensible. The legibility defense, the claim that the audience can read the show's harmless intent, becomes almost irrelevant in this situation, because the problem was never about intent. The writers obviously did not intend to comment on a bombing that had not yet happened. The problem was that a joke about mass casualties at a specific real event acquired a meaning after the fact that no amount of stated intent could neutralize. The cutaway did not become offensive because someone misread it. It became offensive because the world supplied a horror that the joke now seemed to be laughing at, and the show could not argue its way out of that with a philosophy built for arguing about intent. There is something worth examining in the asymmetry of the show's 2 reactions, because it exposes a kind of selective courage. Confronting the hoax was easy in the sense that the show was unambiguously in the right, defending itself against a verifiable lie, and a forceful public statement cost nothing and earned sympathy. Confronting the original cutaway would have been harder, because it would have required either defending a joke about running over marathon runners in the immediate aftermath of a marathon bombing, which was impossible, or admitting that the joke had been a mistake, which the show's whole identity resisted. Faced with that choice, the show took neither path publicly. It removed the episode and said little about the gag itself, choosing disappearance over either defense or apology. Some sources suggest McFarlane came to regret the scene, though that regret is not as firmly documented as his loud condemnation of the hoax, and the contrast stands regardless. The show knew exactly how to respond to being lied about. It was far less sure how to respond to having genuinely gone too far, and its answer was to make the evidence vanish. The episode's nearly decade-long absence is itself a statement, and so is its eventual return. The work stayed off streaming for years, treated as too radioactive to surface, until it quietly reappeared on a streaming service in September 2022, more than 9 years after the bombing. Nothing about the episode changed in that interval. What changed, again, was context, the slow cooling of a wound, until the cutaway could once more be filed as ordinary tasteless comedy rather than a fresh insult. The same logic that buried the episode eventually unburied it. Distance from the tragedy made the joke airable again, which confirms that the joke's offensiveness was always a function of timing rather than content. A gag that is unspeakable 1 month and acceptable 9 years years later, was never being judged on what it said. It was being judged on what was happening in the world around it, which is a deeply uncomfortable standard for a show that liked to insist its jokes meant nothing and harmed no one. The Islamophobia layer deserves a return, because it is the part of the episode that the bombing distracted everyone from, and it is arguably the part that should have drawn the most scrutiny. The marathon cutaway was a one-off shock gag, the kind of thing the show produced constantly. The terrorist plot was something more considered, a full episode that flirted with a message about not judging Muslims and then betrayed that message by making the Muslim character a literal bomber, validating the prejudice the episode pretended to critique. That structure cannot be excused by the equal opportunity defense, because the episode does not mock the suspicion of Muslims and then mock something else in turn. It stages the suspicion, has a character condemn it, and then proves the suspicion correct, which lands the episode squarely on the side of the bigotry it gestured at rejecting. A contemporary review caught this precisely, noting that the show seemed unaware of how thoroughly the broader culture had reduced Middle Eastern characters to a single role. The bombing buried that conversation, because once the marathon cutaway became the story, nobody was arguing about the show's treatment of Islam anymore. A real tragedy involving Muslim perpetrators arrived weeks after an episode that had cast a Muslim character as a secret terrorist, and the grim coincidence overwhelmed any chance of discussing the episode's actual politics. Set against the thesis that runs through this video, Turban Cowboy is the moment the show's relationship with its own provocations turned genuinely incoherent. The philosophy held that no joke could really harm anyone, because the targets were everyone and the intent was clear. This episode demolished both halves of that comfort at once. The marathon gag showed that a joke's harm could be entirely independent of intent, manufactured by events the show did not control. The terrorist plot showed that the equal opportunity claim collapses when an episode actually endorses a prejudice rather than distributing its mockery evenly. And the show's response, fierce against the lie and silent about the truth, showed that even the people making it could not fully defend what they had done by their own stated rules. The episode is where the philosophy stopped being a confident shield and started looking like something the show reached for when convenient and abandoned when reality made it untenable. What the marathon episode could not test was the show's relationship with the one institution that had power over it from the very beginning, the network. Reality decided this episode's fate, and critics and public figures had decided others, but there remained a category of provocation that the network itself would refuse to broadcast at all, not over a slur, not over a tragedy, but over a subject so charged that Fox would not let the episode air on American television in any form. That subject was not race, religion, or disability. It was the one topic where the show discovered that even being an equal opportunity offender had a hard legal and commercial limit, and the episode built around it became the only one in the show's history to be banned outright from the country that made it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A month-old shock gag became unairable the instant a real bombing gave it meaning, and the show fought the lie about the episode far louder than it ever defended the truth of it, then let the work vanish for nearly a decade. Reality had drawn one kind of line. The network was about to draw another, refusing to broadcast a single episode anywhere in the country over a subject no slur had ever triggered. Section 7. Partial terms of endearment. The one that never aired of every episode the show ever produced, the one that drew the harshest punishment from its own network, was not its cruelest, its most violent, or its most bigoted. It was, by the standards of the show's usual provocations, relatively restrained, and it engaged its subject with more balance than the program typically managed. Partial Terms of Endearment is the only episode in the history of Family Guy banned outright from American television, kept off Fox entirely, kept off the cable channels that aired everything else, kept off the streaming services that hosted the rest of the catalog. The reason had nothing to do with a slur, a tragedy, or a vulnerable group. The reason was a single subject so politically radioactive in the United States that the network would not let the episode exist on any screen it controlled. That subject was abortion, and the episode's fate reveals more about where the real limits sat than any joke the show ever told. The episode's placement in the catalog is itself slightly unsettled, and the discrepancy is worth naming rather than papering over. Most listings treat it as the final episode of the 8th season, while its production code marks it as part of the 7th season's production run, which is why some catalogs file it at a different point in the sequence. Whatever number gets assigned to it, the facts of its making are clear. It was written by Danny Smith and directed by Joseph Lee, produced as a standard episode, and then quietly removed from the broadcast schedule before American audiences ever saw it. The premise is genuinely dark, which is normal for the show, and the darkness is built into the plot rather than bolted on as a shock gag. An old friend from Lois's college years, Naomi, asks Lois to serve as a surrogate mother because she and her husband cannot conceive on their own. Lois agrees and becomes pregnant with the couple's child. Then the couple dies in a car accident, leaving Lois carrying a pregnancy for parents who no longer exist. And the episode becomes about the decision she now faces, whether to carry the pregnancy to term and raise the child, or to end it. That setup forces the characters into the actual substance of the abortion debate, and the episode does not flinch from putting the arguments on screen. It stages encounters with protesters protesters outside a clinic, parodies of the rhetoric used by both sides, and a deliberately over-the-top anti-abortion propaganda video, voiced by a guest performer, that mocks the scare tactics of one camp. The show points its satire in multiple directions, ribbing the absurdities of activists on more than one side of the issue, rather than mounting a single argument. Critics who eventually saw the episode on home video noted exactly this even-handedness, and several found the controversy overblown, precisely because the humor was so typical of the show. Reviewers pointed out that the episode handled its serious subject with a relatively light touch, that it showed the pros and cons of the situation without delivering childish insults to either side, and that the comedy was the ordinary Family Guy register rather than anything especially vicious. One assessment rated it positively and suggested that anyone expecting a scandalous provocation would be surprised by how conventional the episode actually was. The thing that got the show banned, in other words, was not a sharpening of its cruelty, it was the topic itself, handled in roughly the way the show handled everything, which is what makes the ban so revealing about the network's real calculus. The ending crystallizes the show's tonal strategy and complicates any reading of the episode as a political statement. After the whole episode wrestles with the decision, the final scene shows Lois at the family table beginning to reflect on all the positives that would come from welcoming another child into the family, building toward what sounds like a sentimental resolution. Before she can finish, Peter turns to the audience and flatly announces that they went ahead and ended the pregnancy, cutting the episode off abruptly. The punchline detonates the build-up, refusing the warm conclusion the scene seemed to promise, and it does so in the show's characteristic manner, with a shrug aimed straight at the viewer. That ending has been read as the writers signaling that the whole thing is fiction and a joke rather than an argument, that they are not staking out a position so much as diffusing a heavy subject with a final shock. The episode engages the issue seriously for most of its runtime, and then, in its last seconds, undercuts any claim that it meant to take a side. Fox was not interested in the nuance. The network decided, before the 8th season even began airing, that the episode would not run, and the show's team announced the ban publicly at a fan convention in 2009. From that point forward, the episode was effectively exiled from American broadcast. It never aired on Fox, never appeared on the cable block that had rescued the Weinstein episode years earlier, never showed up in syndication, and was kept off the major streaming platforms even as those services hosted uncut versions of nearly everything else the show had made. The only way American audiences could legally see it was on a standalone DVD released on September 28, 2010, sold as the episode Too Hot for Television. Footage from it was eventually discussed during a live-action retrospective special in 2012, but the episode itself remained, and largely remains, absent from American screens. The contrast with how the episode was treated outside the United States is the detail that exposes what the ban was really about. The same episode Fox would not air on any American screen received its world premiere in the United Kingdom on BBC Three on June 20, 2010, broadcast in its ordinary primetime slot where it reached around 1 million homes and drew positive reviews. It aired in Australia as well. The content that was unbroadcastable in the country that made it was perfectly broadcastable across the Atlantic, which means the problem was never the content in any universal sense. The problem was specifically American, tied to the specific political temperature of abortion in the United States and the specific commercial risk that topic posed to an American broadcast network and its advertisers. A British channel could air the episode in primetime without incident. An American network could not air it at all. The episode did not change between those two broadcasts. What changed was the market it was being broadcast into. That is the insight the ban delivers, and it reframes the entire question of what going too far even means for a show like this. Throughout this video, going too far has meant different things in different sections, decided by different authorities. A network worried about a libel shelved one episode, critics argued for years about another. A public figure fought the show over a third. A real tragedy buried a fourth. Partial terms of endearment introduces a fifth kind of limit, one that has almost nothing to do with harm and almost everything to do with risk. The episode was not banned because it wounded a vulnerable group or trafficked in a slur. It was banned because abortion is the kind of subject that organizes boycotts, alienates advertisers, and angers affiliates, and a broadcast network exists to sell audiences to advertisers without that kind of disruption. The line Fox would not cross was not a moral line. It was a commercial and political one, and the episode that hit it was, by the show's own standards, fairly tame. Holding this episode beside the marathon episode from the previous section makes the inversion impossible to miss. Turban Cowboy contained a cutaway depicting the mass slaughter of marathon runners, a genuinely cruel joke about killing real categories of people, and that episode aired on Fox without obstruction. It was only pulled after a real bombing made it untenable, and even then it eventually returned to streaming. Partial Terms of Endearment contained no comparable cruelty, engaged a serious issue with relative balance, and was never permitted to air at all. The cruel episode ran freely and was removed only by tragedy. The balanced episode was suppressed from the start and has never been reinstated. If harm were the measure, those outcomes would be reversed. They are not reversed, which tells us that the institution policing the show was not primarily measuring harm, it was measuring fostering controversy, the likelihood that an episode would generate the kind of organized backlash that costs a network money, and by that measure, a thoughtful abortion episode was far more dangerous than a gag about running over a crowd. The comparison with the Weinstein episode from earlier in this story sharpens the point further, because both episodes were suppressed by the network, yet for opposite reasons. The Weinstein episode was held back out of fear it would be read as bigoted, that it would make the show and the network look hateful toward a religious group. Partial Terms of Endearment was held back despite containing no bigotry, simply because it touched a partisan nerve. The two interventions reveal two distinct fears living inside the same institution. One fear is reputational, the worry about appearing prejudiced. The other fear is commercial and political, the worry about appearing to take a side on an issue that divides the country down the middle. The show's equal opportunity philosophy was built to address the first fear, the charge of prejudice, by insisting that everyone gets mocked equally. It had no answer at all for the second fear, because abortion is not a group to be mocked alongside other groups. It is a fault line, and standing anywhere near it, even with jokes aimed in every direction, was enough to make the network refuse the episode. There is a further irony in the fact that the ban could not actually erase the episode, only keep it off American broadcast. The episode was sold on DVD in the United States, aired in full abroad, and discussed openly in the show's own retrospective. Anyone determined to see it could see it. The ban functioned as a commercial firewall rather than a true suppression, protecting Fox's broadcast business and its advertiser relationships, while leaving the content freely available through channels that carried no such risk. That distinction matters, because it confirms once more that the issue was the broadcast context rather than the work itself. The episode was fine to own, fine to sell, fine to air in another country, fine to talk about on Fox's own air. It was unacceptable only in the one specific form that exposed the network to American advertiser and affiliate backlash, which is the narrowest and most commercial definition of going too far imaginable. Set against the thesis running through this video, Partial Terms of Endearment is the episode that proves the show's transgressions were always being judged by more than one standard at once, and that the standards did not agree with each other. The audience judged by taste and by personal experience of harm. Critics judged by craft and by the politics of representation. Reality, in the Marathon case, judged by tragic coincidence. The network judged by commercial risk, and the network's judgment was the only one with the absolute power to prevent an episode from existing on American television. The show could survive bad reviews, public feuds, and even the fallout from a tragedy, because none of those could stop it from broadcasting. It could not survive the network deciding an episode was too commercially dangerous to air, and the one time that happened, the cause was not cruelty or bigotry, but a topic that frightened advertisers. The equal opportunity philosophy had nothing to say to that kind of limit, because that limit was never about offense in the first place. What the abortion ban did not test was the area where the show's Whose Side Are We On defense faced its most genuinely difficult case, the place where the politics were not partisan but personal, and where the show's progressive instincts collided with the way it actually wrote a marginalized group. The network feared abortion because it divided the audience. The next controversy divided something harder to manage. The show's own claim to be on the right side of a community, it kept turning into a punchline, and it centered on the show's most relentless sexual character and a single transformation that forced the writers to decide what they actually believe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The only episode banned outright in America was not the cruelest one, but the one that frightened advertisers, proving the network measured commercial risk rather than harm, and aired a marathon massacre gag while burying a balanced abortion story. Partisan controversy was one kind of danger. The next was more personal, when the show's claim to stand with a marginalized group ran headlong into how it actually wrote them. Section 8, Quagmire, IDA, and the sexuality line. Every controversy so far involved a show defending a joke it did not necessarily believe in, a provocation aimed at a target the writers held at arm's length. The episode at the center of this section is different, because here the show's intentions were genuinely good, and the results still landed as harm. Quagmire's Dad is the case where the Whose Side Are We On defense, the foundational argument laid out at the start of this video, faced the test it was least equipped to survive, a situation in which the creator's sympathies really were with the marginalized group, and the execution still drew condemnation from the people that group's advocates were trying to protect. The episode reveals that legible good intentions are not the same thing as a kind result, and that a show can mean well and wound deeply in the same 22 minutes. The episode aired on Fox on May 9, 2010, the 18th episode of the 8th season, directed by Pete Michels. Its writing credit is one of the details worth flagging as unsettled in the public record, because the question of who actually wrote it became part of the controversy's afterlife. The episode is credited to Tom Devaney. Years later, MacFarlane attributed it to a different writer, Steve Callahan, saying Callahan drew on his own experience of having a parent who transitioned, and reporting at the time noted the mismatch, pointing out that Callahan was listed as an executive producer rather than the episode's writer. The discrepancy matters because MacFarlane used the personal connection as part of his defense, and the connection is harder to weigh when the person it belongs to is not the credited author. The most that can be stated with confidence is that the show's creator publicly tied the episode to a writer's lived family experience, while the formal credit names someone else. The premise is the engine of everything everything that followed. Quagmire's father, a decorated Navy veteran and war hero named Dan, returns to Quahog and reveals that he has always felt himself to be a woman in a man's body. Dan decides to undergo gender confirmation surgery and begins living as a woman named Ida Davis. McFarlane himself voiced both Dan and Ida. The sympathetic thread McFarlane has always pointed to lives here, in the idea that Quagmire's father remains a hero and a parent deserving of respect after transitioning, that the transition does not erase the person. Running alongside that thread, though, is the material that drew the condemnation. Brian, returning from a trip, meets Ida at a bar, finds her charming, and sleeps with her, not knowing she is Quagmire's post-operative parent. When he learns the truth, Brian vomits violently and continuously for roughly 30 unbroken seconds. A sustained physical revulsion played as the comic payoff of the encounter. Other moments compounded the problem. Lois throws out food that Ida prepared. Peter and Lois make disparaging remarks. Critics argued that some of the episode's framing drew a line connecting transgender people to sexual deviance, and a later confrontation ends with Brian flinging a crude, taunting boast at Quagmire about having slept with his parent. The reaction from advocacy organizations was swift and serious. The major LGBTQ media organization, GLAAD, released a statement noting that it shared the serious concerns being voiced by members of the community, and it characterized the predominant opinion as holding that the episode was deeply offensive to transgender people. The objection did not center on the existence of a trans character, which would have been progress in 2010, when trans representation on network comedy was nearly non-existent. The objection centered on the vomiting, on the disgust, on the way the episode used a trans woman's body as the trigger for a heterosexual character's horror. The complaint was that the episode introduced a trans person and then made her transness the source of revulsion, encoding the message that intimacy with a trans woman was something to be physically sickened by. Critics writing at the time put it bluntly, with one saying it was impossible to reconcile the episode itself with the sympathetic intentions McFarlane claimed for it. McFarlane's defense of the episode is the most extensively documented in this entire story, and it shifted in revealing ways over more than a decade. Before the episode aired, he predicted confidently that the transgender community would be very happy with it, describing it in advance as probably the most sympathetic portrayal of a trans character ever to appear on television. That prediction collided immediately with the actual response. After the backlash, in a 2010 interview, he expressed surprise at the reaction and stood by his view that Ida was a sympathetic portrayal. He also defended the vomiting scene with an analogy widely regarded as ill-judged, comparing Brian's reaction to the disgust he imagined he himself would feel in the same situation, and likening it to a gay man's hypothetical revulsion at female anatomy. The analogy did not soothe the criticism, it deepened it, because it treated a trans woman's body as inherently disgusting to a straight man, and offered that disgust as natural, rather than as something the episode might have interrogated. By 2015, the defense had matured into the Archie Bunker argument that anchored the opening section of this video. Speaking to an interviewer, McFarlane reached back to All in the Family, the 1970s sitcom built around a bigot whose ugly lines audiences laughed at because they understood the show's sympathies lay against him. He argued that scenes and comments from the Quagmire episode were being pulled out of the context of an episode that was really about Quagmire and Ida coming to terms with a new relationship, and he expressed frustration at how the responses had read the worst moments in isolation. That is the legibility defense in its purest form, the claim that the audience should be able to read past an individual ugly moment to the creator's underlying decency. As late as 2022, in another interview, McFarlane said he would not make any large change to the episode, that any reconsideration was about individual moments and jokes rather than the whole, and that the episode's intent was to establish Quagmire's father as a war hero still worthy of respect. He attributed the writing to Callahan's personal experience and held firm that the episode meant well. A fair account has to acknowledge that the defense is not empty, and that some viewers experienced the episode the way McFarlane intended. One entertainment writer at the time called it surprisingly kind by the show's standards and ranked it among the better episodes. The portrayal of Ida as a competent, dignified war hero genuinely exists in the episode, alongside the cruelty, and a show that wanted only to mock trans people would not have bothered to make her a decorated veteran whose son's respect was the emotional question of the plot. McFarlane's broader record reinforces the sincerity of the intent. He has been an open and consistent supporter of gay rights for his entire public career, has used his platform to argue against the religious right's hostility to LGBTQ people, and did not undergo the conservative turn that some of his comedic peers did. The good intentions are real, and dismissing them would falsify the situation as badly as ignoring the harm would. The episode's importance to this video lies precisely in that combination, because it demonstrates the exact failure mode the legibility defense cannot survive. The defense assumes that good intent, once legible, redeems the rough material around it. Quagmire's dad shows intent and result coming apart even when the intent is genuine and the creator is sincere. McFarlane meant the episode as a sympathetic portrait, predicted the community would embrace it, and watched the community's leading organization condemn it instead. The people best positioned to read the episode, transgender viewers and the advocates who spoke for them, read it carefully and concluded it harmed them, and they reached that conclusion despite the sympathetic war hero thread MacFarlane kept pointing to. Their reading was not a failure to get the joke, it was a recognition that the joke and the sympathy lived in the same episode, and that the 30 seconds of vomiting did real work regardless of how respectfully Ida was framed elsewhere. The defense says a kind heart makes the cruelty readable as harmless. The episode says a kind heart and genuine cruelty can occupy the same frame, and that the people on the receiving end are under no obligation to forgive the second because of the first. The structural problem is that the episode tries to hold two incompatible things at once, which is the show's signature move raised to a subject that could not absorb it. One register presents Ida as a person worthy of dignity and her son's love. The other register stages her transness as the punchline of a disgust gag. The show's whole method is built on holding contradictory tones simultaneously, cutting between sincerity and shock, and that method usually works because the targets can absorb the ambiguity. A community fighting for basic recognition could not absorb it, because the disgust register reinforced exactly the stigma the dignity register was supposedly opposing, and the two did not cancel out. They coexisted, and the coexistence itself was the harm. An episode that is simultaneously the most sympathetic trans portrayal on television, as its creator claimed, and incredibly offensive to trans people, as GLAAD reported, is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is an accurate description of what the show actually made, a single work legible as both at the same time. The transatlantic pattern from the previous section reappears here in a smaller key, and it underlines how unstable the verdict on the episode was. When the episode aired in the United Kingdom, late at night, the broadcast regulator received a single complaint, opened an investigation, and ultimately cleared the episode, finding it within bounds. The same episode that a major American advocacy organization called deeply offensive was judged acceptable by a British regulator after formal review. That gap does not prove either party wrong. It shows that the episode sat right on a contested line where reasonable institutions disagreed about whether it had crossed, which is the same instability that ran through the marathon episode and the abortion episode. The show kept producing work that one authority would condemn and another would wave through, and Quagmire's Dad is that pattern applied to gender identity. What makes this episode the hinge of the whole story is what happened to the defense over time, because MacFarlane never abandoned it while the show around him quietly did. He was still standing by Quagmire's Dad in 2022, saying he would not make a large change, insisting the intent justified the result. Yet the criticism did not fade, and later episodes featuring Ida drew fresh objections, with a trans writer in 2019 calling out the show's lazy jokes about trans people and reacting bitterly to the framing that treated willingness to sleep with a trans woman as a kind of heroism. The community's verdict held and hardened across the decade, even as the creator's defense stayed frozen in place. That divergence between a creator who would not concede and a cultural consensus that kept tightening set up the strangest move the show ever made. Because while MacFarlane was defending old episodes, the show itself, in its own voice, announced that it was retiring an entire category of the humor those episodes were built on. The creator held the line in interview. The program crossed it on screen and admitted as much in a single deadpan sentence aimed at the President of the United States. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Quagmire's Dad was the case where genuine good intent and genuine harm shared the same episode, where the creator predicted the community would cheer and its leading advocates condemned it instead, proving a kind heart never guaranteed a kind result. MacFarlane defended that episode for over a decade and never moved. The show, meanwhile, quietly decided to retire the whole category of joke, and said so out loud in one deadpan line. Section 9. The Phase Out. On January 13, 2019, in an episode built around Peter becoming Donald Trump's press secretary, the show did something it had never done in 20 years on the air. It announced, in its own voice, that it was retiring a category of its own comedy. During a confrontation between Peter and an animated Trump, the president needles Peter by saying that generations of children have learned their favorite Jewish, black, and gay jokes from the show. Peter replies that they have been trying to phase out the gay stuff, then deflects with the observation that he is only a cartoon, while Trump is the actual president. The line was delivered as a throwaway gag, the kind of self-referential aside the show tosses off constantly, and it would have been easy to dismiss as one more joke about the show's own reputation. It was not a joke. Within days, the people running the program confirmed that the line meant exactly what it said, and the confirmation amounts to the show grading its own past and finding part of it wanting. The episode itself, titled around the Trump premise, was a satire of the president, and it carried its own provocations, including a sequence in which the animated Trump behaves grotesquely toward Peter's daughter Meg, prompting Peter to fight him. Buried inside that broader Trump material was the phase-out line, and reporters pressed the show's executive producers, Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, on whether it was sincere or merely another instance of the show winking at its audience. Their answers removed any doubt. Asked directly whether the show was really phasing out gay jokes, Sulkin said yes, more or less, and laid out the reasoning. He observed that an episode from 2005 or 2006, placed beside an episode from 2018 or 2019, would show clear differences, and that some of the things the writers had once felt comfortable saying and joking about, they now understood to be unacceptable. Appel added the part that matters most for this story. He insisted the change was not the show reacting to external prohibition, not a case of the writers being told what they could no longer say. The change, he said, came from within. The writers themselves had changed. The climate was different, the culture was different, and their own views were different, shaped by the reality around them, and a show that had been on the air for 2 decades had to shift and evolve along with that reality. That framing is the entire significance of the phase-out, and it is worth separating from the simpler story of a show softening with age. Appel and Sulkin could have said the network forced their hand, or that audiences had become too sensitive, or that they were bowing to pressure while privately disagreeing. Any of those would have preserved the show's original philosophy intact, casting the change as a surrender to outside forces, rather than a genuine reconsideration. They said the opposite. They said the writer's own understanding of what was acceptable had moved, that the room now recognized as harmful things it had once treated as fair game. That is not a show being censored. It is a show revising its own theory of comedy, the very theory laid out at the start of this video, the equal opportunity philosophy that held all targets were fair, because the mockery was distributed and the intent was decent. The phase-out is the custodians of that philosophy, admitting that some of what it had licensed was not harmless distributed mockery after all, but the kind of joke that did damage to a group still fighting for basic standing. The category they chose to retire is the detail that ties this section to the one before it. The phase-out was specifically about gay joke, about humor aimed at sexuality and, by extension, gender identity, which is exactly the territory of the Quagmire and Ida episode. For most of the show's run, jokes at the expense of gay people were a staple, woven through episode after episode as reliable comic filler, and the show's defenders had always justified them with the legibility argument, the claim that McFarlane's well-known support for gay rights made the jokes readable as friendly ribbing rather than hostility. The phase-out is an implicit concession that this defense had limits, that being on the right side politically did not make every joke land as harmless, and that the accumulated weight of 2 decades of gay punchlines amounted to something the writers no longer wanted to be responsible for. The category that got retired is the category the previous section showed the show getting most painfully wrong, which means the phase-out can be read as a delayed answer to the criticism that had dogged episodes like Quagmire's dad from the start. What makes the moment genuinely strange, rather than simply a tidy redemption arc, is that the show's creator did not move with his own show. The phase-out was announced in 2019 by the showrunners. As late as 2022, 3 years later, McFarlane was still publicly defending the Quagmire episode, saying he would not make a large change to it and that its intentions justified its content. The show, in its own voice and through the people running its writer's room, declared that the category of humor those old episodes belonged to was being retired as no longer acceptable. The founder, in interviews, kept defending the specific old episodes within that category. That divergence is real and documented, and it complicates any clean narrative of the show growing up. The institution evolved while the individual who built it held his ground, and both things were true at the same time. The program that announced it had changed its mind was, in part, run by someone who had not changed his. There is a craft dimension to how the announcement was made that reveals the show's instincts even in the act of reforming them. The phase-out was not delivered as a statement, an apology, or a serious acknowledgement. It was delivered as a joke, wrapped inside the exact irreverence it was promising to tone down, and it came with a built-in deflection. Peter does not simply say the show is retiring gay jokes. He says it while pointing at Trump and noting that he is merely a cartoon while Trump is the real president, which redirects attention from the show's own conduct toward a more powerful target. That deflection is a softer version of the equal opportunity move that has run through this entire story. The instinct to excuse oneself by gesturing at someone worse. Even in the moment of conceding that some of its humor crossed a line, the show could not resist comparing itself favorably to a bigger offender, as if to say its sins were minor next to the genuine article. The announcement of evolution was itself performed in the show's old voice, which suggests how deep the original instincts ran. The substance of the change, as opposed to the announcement, was incremental and incomplete, and honesty requires saying so. The producers chose the phrase phase out rather than stop, language that promised gradual reduction rather than a clean break, and the actual shift in the episodes bore that out. Observers tracking the later seasons noted that the gay jokes of the show's 19th season were somewhat less crass than those of its early years, that the humor had been sanded down rather than removed, with the comedy in later episodes more often built on a character's obliviousness than on a slur or a leer. The change was real and visible in the texture of the writing, and it was also partial, a matter of degree rather than a wholesale abandonment. A program does not erase 2 decades of comic habit in a single season, and the show did not pretend to. The phase-out was a direction of travel, a stated intention to drift away from a kind of joke, and the drift was slow. The selectivity of the concession is as telling as the concession itself. The show announced it was phasing out gay jokes. It did not announce that it was phasing out racial humor, religious mockery, jokes about disability, or any of the other categories that had drawn fire across its history. The self-revision was narrow, aimed at one specific target group, and silent about the rest. That narrowness echoes the pattern established earlier in this video, where the Cleveland recasting addressed the question of who voiced the character while leaving the writing untouched. The same showrunners, Appel and Sulkin, drove both moves, the recasting of Cleveland and the phasing out of gay jokes, and both share the same shape, a real and visible concession on one specific front paired with silence about the deeper or broader version of the criticism. The late period show became a program of partial, category-by-category adjustments, conceding ground where the cultural pressure was sharpest and holding position elsewhere, rather than reconsidering its founding philosophy as a whole. A skeptical reading of the phase-out is available and deserves a hearing, because the change can be doubted from two opposite directions. Some longtime fans received the announcement as cowardice, as the show abandoning the fearlessness that had defined it, capitulating to a cultural mood rather than standing by its own irreverence. From the other direction, some critics doubted the phase-out was genuine at all, suspecting it was a public relations gesture designed to harvest goodwill while the show continued largely as before. The gradualness of the actual change gave both skepticisms something to grip. A show that says it is phasing out a kind of joke rather than stopping has given itself room to keep telling that joke at a reduced rate indefinitely, which can be read as either honest acknowledgement that change takes time or as a hedge that commits to nothing. The available evidence supports a middle reading. The writer's stated change of heart appears sincere, given how they framed it as their own evolution rather than external pressure, and the execution was real but slow, which is what an honest, gradual shift would also look like. The phase-out was neither pure capitulation nor pure marketing. It was a genuine and limited course correction, announced in the show's characteristic voice and carried out at the show's characteristic pace. Set against the thesis that has run through this video, the phase-out is the clearest possible evidence that the show's transgressions were never as fully defended internally as the public argument suggested. For 20 years, the show's posture toward criticism was the equal opportunity defense, the confident insistence that the critics had simply misread harmless comedy. The phase-out is the show abandoning that posture on one front, conceding that the critics had been right about a category of its humor, that some of what it had called harmless had in fact been unacceptable. A program fully convinced of its own innocence does not retire its jokes and does not say, through the people who run it, that it now understands certain things to be wrong. The fact that the show said exactly that means the doubt had been there all along, inside the writer's room, beneath the public confidence. The equal opportunity philosophy had always been, in part, a way of not having to examine the harm, and the phase-out is the moment the examination finally surfaced in public, in the show's own voice. The phase-out also brings the long arc of this story to its natural endpoint, because it is the last and largest in a series of concessions that the late period show kept making. The recasting of Cleveland conceded the question of authorship on race. The phase-out conceded a category of humor on sexuality. Both came from the same showrunners in the same era, and both shared the same partial, specific shape. What remains, after all of it, is the question of what the whole sequence adds up to, whether the catalog of moments where the show went too far tells a story of a program that grew a conscience, a program that merely managed its public relations, or something more complicated than either. Every controversy traced through these sections, from the buried Weinstein episode to the abortion ban to the marathon gag to the trans panic discussed, was a single test of one underlying philosophy, and the show spent its later years quietly conceding that the philosophy had failed some of those tests. The final accounting is what remains, the ledger of what the show actually did, what it admitted, what it refused to admit, and what the whole long experiment finally revealed about a comedy that spent more than 2 decades insisting it could joke about anything as long as its heart was in the right place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The phase-out was the show grading its own philosophy and finding part of it wrong, conceding through its own showrunners that some of what it once called harmless had in fact been unacceptable, even as its creator kept defending the old episodes. Every controversy in this story tested a single underlying theory of comedy. What that whole experiment finally added up to is the last thing left to account for. Section 10, The Ledger. A show that spent more than 20 years insisting it could joke about anything, as long as its heart was in the right place, eventually conceded, in its own voice and through the people who ran it, that the insistence had been wrong about part of itself. That concession is the whole story compressed into a single fact, and everything traced across the previous 9 sections leads to it. Family Guy was never a program that stumbled randomly into controversy. It operated on a stated theory of comedy, the equal opportunity defense joined to the claim that a creator's decent intentions remain legible underneath even the ugliest joke, and it tested that theory harder and longer than almost any program in the history of American television. The catalog of moments where it went too far is the record of that theory being stress-tested in public, and the verdict the show finally reached on itself is more revealing than any individual joke it ever told. The theory was laid out in full at the beginning, in the form MacFarlane has defended for his entire career. A comedy that mocks everyone equally cannot be accused of singling anyone out, the argument runs, and a show whose sympathies are visible underneath the cruelty earns the right to stage that cruelty for laughs. MacFarlane reached repeatedly for All in the Family and its bigoted central character to make the point, arguing that audiences laughed at Archie Bunker because they understood the the writers stood against him. The defense rests entirely on legibility, on the assumption that a thoughtful viewer can read intent through irony and tell the difference between a show endorsing an ugly idea and a show mocking the people who hold it. Every controversy in this story is a test of whether that assumption held, and the tests returned a remarkably consistent answer. The assumption held sometimes, failed often, and could not be relied upon at all when the stakes were highest. The first test came before any audience was involved, which already exposed a flaw in the theory. When Fox shelved the Weinstein episode out of fear it would read as anti-Semitic, the show's intent never reached the public because the network's professional readers of intent judged it too dangerous and buried it. The detail that the creator had shown the script to 2 rabbis before production revealed that even the people most committed to the philosophy harbored private doubts about whether decent intent would carry the material. Legibility was supposed to come for free. The rabbinical vetting showed the show knew from the start that it might have to be earned and might still fail. Race put the theory under a pressure it was never built to withstand, and the long argument over Cleveland Brown exposed the precise seam where it tore. The equal opportunity defense is an argument about content, about the even-handed distribution of mockery, and it has nothing to say about authorship, about whose hand draws the caricature and whose voice performs it. For 2 decades, a black character was voiced by a white man, written by a largely white room, and used as the lone black presence in a white friend group, and no defense about the content of individual jokes could answer the structural objection to that arrangement. When the show finally responded, in 2020, it conceded only the part the defense had ignored. It changed who voiced the character and left the writing intact, which marked the first move in the show's history from defending itself to revising itself, and also established the partial, single-front shape that every later concession would share. The Palin episode demonstrated the legibility defense working and failing at the same instant, depending entirely on who was watching. A single line about a child with Down syndrome was read by a powerful critic as cruelty toward the disabled, and by the performer at the center of the joke, a woman who has Down syndrome herself, as sharp satire aimed at the critic's own political conduct. Both readers had genuine standing, and they reached opposite conclusions about the same scene. The show had done everything its philosophy recommended, aiming the satire at a powerful figure and casting the role from lived experience, and it still split the community it might have claimed to defend. The episode proved that the show could control its intent and never control the wound, because the wound lived in the audience rather than in the script. Reality delivered the next verdict, and it was the one the philosophy was least able to absorb. The marathon cutaway in the Turban Cowboy episode aired without obstruction for a month, then became unspeakable the instant a real bombing gave it meaning, without a single frame changing. The show responded by fighting the false hoax clip loudly, while burying the genuine episode quietly, defending itself fiercely against a lie, and saying almost nothing about the truth. That episode also carried a terrorist plot that staged a critique of anti-Muslim prejudice, and then validated the prejudice by making the Muslim character a literal bomber, which the equal opportunity defense cannot excuse, because the episode did not distribute its mockery evenly. It landed on one religion and confirmed the bigoted suspicion. The marathon coincidence buried that conversation, but the Islamophobia was the deeper problem, and it was a problem the theory had no answer for. The abortion ban revealed where the show's most powerful overseer actually drew its line, and the line had almost nothing to do with harm. Partial Terms of Endearment, a relatively balanced episode that engaged a serious issue with more restraint than the show usually managed, became the only episode banned outright from American television, while the cruel marathon gag had aired freely until a tragedy forced its removal. If harm were the measure, those outcomes would be reversed. They were not, which means the network was measuring commercial and political risk rather than harm, refusing an episode that frightened advertisers while broadcasting one that depicted mass slaughter. The same episode aired in prime time in Britain without incident, confirming that the ban was a commercial firewall specific to the American market, rather than any judgment about the work itself. The Quagmire and Ida episode exposed the failure mode the legibility defense truly could not survive, because here the intent was genuinely good and the harm was genuine too, in the same 22 minutes. McFarlane meant the episode as a sympathetic portrait of a trans war hero, predicted the community would embrace it, and watched its leading advocates condemn it instead. The sympathetic thread and the disgust gag lived in the same episode, legible as both kindness and cruelty at once, and the people on the receiving end were under no obligation to forgive the second because of the first. A kind heart, the episode demonstrated, does not guarantee a kind result, and being on the right side politically does not make every joke land as harmless. The defense had always assumed that legible decency redeemed the rough material around it, and this episode showed decency and cruelty simply coexisting, with the coexistence itself doing the damage. The phase-out completed the arc because it was the show conceding, in its own voice, that the philosophy had failed on at least one front. The showrunners did not blame the network or the audience. They said the writers themselves had changed, that they now understood as unacceptable things they had once treated as fair game, and that the show had to evolve with a changed culture. That is the equal opportunity philosophy being revised by its own custodians, an admission that some of what it had licensed was not harmless distributed mockery but real harm. The concession was partial, aimed only at gay jokes and silent about the other categories, and it it diverged from the show's own creator, who kept defending the old episodes years after the program announced it had moved on. A show fully convinced of its innocence does not retire its jokes, and the fact that this one did means the doubt had been there all along. Laid end to end, the 9 controversies tell a single coherent story about a single philosophy. The theory held that intent plus distribution equals immunity, that a show meaning well and mocking everyone could say anything. Each test chipped at one part of that equation. The Weinstein episode showed that intent could be vetoed before it was ever read. The Cleveland debate showed that distribution of content says nothing about authorship. The Palin fight showed that intent is controllable and reception is not. The Marathon episode showed that meaning can be made by context the author never chose, and that distribution collapses when an episode endorses a prejudice outright. The abortion ban showed that the institution policing the show was measuring risk rather than harm. The trans episode showed that good intent and real harm can occupy the same frame. The phase out showed the show itself finally agreeing that the theory had limits. By the end, almost nothing of the original confident defense remained standing, and the people who had built it were the ones dismantling it. What this means beyond the show itself is the part worth dwelling on, because Family Guy is an unusually complete record of a shift the whole culture went through. The program began in 1999, in an era when the dominant comic ethos held that anything could be joked about, and that taking offense was itself a kind of failure, a humorlessness to be mocked. It ran straight through the long change that followed, the slow cultural turn toward weighing the harm a joke does against the laugh it earns, toward asking who pays for the comedy rather than only whether it lands. Most shows that embodied the old ethos either ended before the change arrived or refused to acknowledge it. Family Guy did something rarer. It ran across the entire transition and documented its own changing mind on screen, conceding ground in public, recasting a character, retiring a category of joke, arguing with its own past in interviews. The catalog of its controversies is, viewed from enough distance, a timeline of how American comedy renegotiated its own permissions over 2 decades. The shape of the show's evolution is honest about how that renegotiation actually happens in commercial media, which is rarely through wholesale reform. The concessions came one pressure point at a time, on the specific fronts where the cultural force was sharpest, and they left the founding philosophy formally intact even as they hollowed it out in practice. Authorship on race got addressed while the writing stayed the same, gay jokes got phased out while other categories continued. The creator held positions his showrunners had abandoned. That is what change looks like inside a long-running, profitable, institutionally complex production. It is partial, uneven, internally contradictory, and driven as much by what becomes commercially untenable as by what becomes morally clear. The show did not transform into a different program with a coherent new ethic. It became a program in tension with itself, still telling versions of the old jokes while apologizing for others, evolving in some rooms and digging in elsewhere. The deepest thing the ledger reveals is that the equal opportunity defense was always, in part, a way of avoiding a harder question. The philosophy let the show treat every objection as a misreading, every critic as someone who failed to get the joke, which meant the show never had to ask whether the joke itself might be the problem, regardless of intent. The late period concessions are the moments that question finally surfaced, when the show stopped insisting the critics had misread and began admitting that some of the readings had been correct all along. A comedy can distribute its mockery perfectly evenly and still cause harm, because harm does not require unfairness, only impact. A creator can have an impeccable heart and still make something that wounds, because the wound is measured by its effect rather than its motive. Those are the truths the show spent 20 years deflecting with its philosophy, and finally, partially, conceded by retiring pieces of it. The going too far moments were never random provocation. They were the points where a flawed theory of comedy met the world and lost, over and over, until even the people who held the theory could no longer pretend it had won. That is the full accounting. A show built a confident defense of its own right to offend, tested that defense against religion, race, disability, tragedy, politics, and identity, and watched it fail in a different way each time, until the program quietly began grading its own past and finding parts of it wanting. The catalog of its worst moments is not a list of jokes that misfired. It is the visible wreckage of an argument about comedy that ran for 2 decades and did not survive contact with the people it was made about. Family Guy proved, through its own long experiment, that meaning well is not the same as doing no harm, and that the most interesting thing a provocative show can do is live long enough to disagree with itself. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.